The Truth Girls.
Hi everyone. Let's talk about the border crisis and the children being separated from their parents. First of all, before I get into what I've actually found out about it, I just want to say that there is always the issue of some aspects of the media taking any opportunity to try to make the Trump administration look as horrible as possible. So whenever I hear, oh, look what Trump is doing, it's something horrible, you have to keep in mind, though, that there are people out there whose sort of whole reason for living is to try to make Trump and everything he does look as horrible as possible. That said, of course, if you listen to the White House and the Trump administration themselves, they're always going to make it sound like they're doing everything great and right. So it's a bit of a challenge to find out what the truth is, and usually it's somewhere in the middle. So the way this story was first brought to my attention was someone at church actually bringing it up and saying this terrible thing is happening, that because of Trump and his administration, children of, they used the word immigrants, they actually said immigrant children are being separated from their families, they're being held in cages, and the worst part was the way they were taken away from their families was the parents were told the children were being taken to have a bath, reminiscent of, I think you know where, somewhere in Europe where things like that happened many years ago. So it was kind of like, wow, horror, this is horrible, what's happening? And I had to look into it because I thought, wow, that has the ring of like the really anti-Trump propaganda, but let's just see what's happening here. How bad is it really? And I found out a few things. That in 2005, it was George Bush created Operation Streamline to deal with this huge influx of not immigrants, but migrants, like people crossing the border illegally and getting busted. So there was Operation Streamline to criminally prosecute all migrants. I almost said immigrants, it's not the same thing. That's where that started, and that has a lot to do with why this is happening now. So any adults that were caught would go through the criminal justice system, not the immigration courts. But the exception was for adults traveling with children. And the goal here was to end catch and release, because what would happen before is they would catch them and they would release them and say, well, you got to come back to immigration court. And guess what? They didn't come back to court. They just disappear into US. So that's really like the border is just an open free-for-all. So they wanted to end this, so they did this, and they would hold the migrants until their hearings, except, like I said, people traveling with children. But the problem with this was, what are you going to do if you want to get across the border in America now? Make sure you have a kid with you. So some people would take advantage of that, and they would bring kids who maybe aren't even their own kids to be able to get across the border, or people would just send their kids by themselves with other people saying, yeah, just say it's your kids, just get our kids in. So this is a huge problem. So what Obama did in 2014, because they also had these cages, pictures of this kind of stuff back then, and what they were doing was families were held together in administrative detention, not criminal detention. And they did things like they put ankle bracelets on them and made them register with certain organizations, so they would then come back for their hearings. And then it would be decided if they can stay or leave. But the problem is that there are a lot of criminals smuggling people over the border, which could include human trafficking or whatever else they're doing, or just using the kids as a way to get through. And so what Trump did now was implement zero tolerance. So instead of before where there was an exception for if you had kids with you, now it's like, no, there's no tolerance because people are using this to get around the system. So what happens now is even if you have kids with you, you're going to be sent for criminal proceedings where, you know, before they made this exception, but now they're like, no, sorry, everyone has to go to criminal court. And of course they can't send the kids, so that's how the kids end up separated. So the children are separated from the parents who are sent to jail. So what happens to these kids? Well, they have different shelters, and depending on the age. There's one in Tornillo, Texas, where they're housing 360 teenagers. So they're between ages of 13 and 17. So don't forget, children includes teens. Just because someone's under 18 doesn't mean they couldn't be a gang member. So, you know, what are you going to do? Just say, oh yes, come on in, we'll put you in foster care. I mean, I can see how this would be a problem. And for some of the really younger ones, they go to what they call a tender age shelter or foster care. And it's supposed to be sorted out within 20 days. But what's really awful is that these kids are separated from their parents. Well, you know, what is the solution? Well, the government says the solution is that instead of trying to sneak over the border, you go to one of the ports of entry where you present as an asylum seeker, because there are channels for that. It's one thing to just sneak in. Let's say you're a criminal or you're doing whatever, you sneak in. That's what criminals do. If you're legitimately asking for asylum, you're supposed to present at a port of entry with your kids. And then none of this will happen. The problem is people don't do that, and they say the reason for that is that these ports of entry, they're not working. They're full, and you'll present and they'll say go back. So people don't want to wait, or I suppose apply for refugee status from their country, so they try to sneak in. So what's the solution? Trump has taken a few steps now. Separated parents are given the option for voluntary deportation. So what's the solution? Well, Trump has taken a few steps in the last few days with all the media attention this issue has been getting. Number one, separated parents are given the option for voluntary deportation amid child reunification. So they can be reunited with their kids, and then they just have to leave the country and not try to get their asylum claims heard. Trump says he will deport without judges or court cases. He says we cannot allow all these people to invade our country. When someone comes in, we must immediately, with no judges or court cases, bring them back from where they came. So that's the other option. You come in the border illegally, you don't get a hearing. You don't go to jail, you don't get a hearing, you don't get an ankle bracelet, you just go back. And he passed a family separations executive order. This executive order is supposed to keep more families together at the border. So here's the big change, is that adults who have children will not be turned over to the Justice Department when they face criminal charges, and will instead stay with their children in detention with the Department of Homeland Security. So they're still going to be in detention, but at least the kids will be with their families. So what is the solution? Well, it would be very presumptuous of me to say, oh, I have the answer. I think it's pretty complicated. But one thing that really struck me was that the legit ports of entry, apparently it's really hard to go through them. It seems to me that if you really want to keep criminals out, you have to make the legal channels more accessible, so that people who could really use them can access them. And at the same time, you have to make it just about impossible to cross the border illegally. You have to have a lot of security and a lot of deterrence. For example, if somebody wants to apply as an asylum seeker, there would be, I'm sure there's rules about who can apply, who can get in. So anyone who's gang affiliated, who has a criminal record, all these kinds of things, going through that process would weed those people out. So if you make the border very secure, but then you have channels for legitimate asylum seekers to get in in a more accessible way, that might solve some of the problem. But definitely it is a problem. And you see some of the people that are coming in and they've got their gang tattoos on them, and obviously you can see why America doesn't want them to come in. But then you have people who are fleeing some kind of horrible situation in South America, fleeing with their children, and these are innocent people who need help, but they're going about it the wrong way. You know, it's going to have to be, no one can just cross over that border, or everyone's going to come in, all the criminals, everybody, right? So like I said, again, I think the only solution is to have more accessible, legit ports of entry for people who have all the documents showing who they are, and then they could go there and then be detained together as families while they're being screened to decide if they're going to be able to come in as refugees or not. But whatever it is, there's not going to be an easy solution, and it's not Trump who just created this situation. This has been going on for a long time. It's an ongoing, complicated problem. It's a problem for a lot of people, not only the people coming over the border, but the people who live in America. It's a big problem, and it's not going to be solved in one day. But I somehow have confidence that they're going to figure something out. So I'm going to be keeping an eye on this. Let me know if you hear anything interesting. So leave me your comments, and thanks for giving me thumbs up. Thanks for your support on Patreon. Thanks for listening to me, and I'll see you next time.